Section 18 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Thomas H. Huxley. Part 2. It is a fine thing to be a great scientist, but it is a yet finer thing to be a great man. The one element in Huxley's life that makes his character stand out clear, sharp, and well defined, was his steadfast devotion to truth. The only thing he feared was self-deception. When he uttered his classic cry in defense of Darwin, there was no ulterior motive in it. No thought that he was attaching himself to a popular success, no idea that he was linking his name with greatness. What he felt was true, he uttered, and the strong desire of his soul was that he might never compromise with the error for the sake of mental ease, or accept a belief simply because it was pleasant. Huxley once wrote this terse sentence of Gladstone: "It is to me a serious thing that the destinies of this great country should at present be to a large extent in the hands of a man who, whatever he may be in the affairs of which I am no judge, is nothing but a copious shuffler in those that I do understand." Gladstone crossed swords with Huxley, Spencer, and Robert Ingersoll, and in each case his blundering intellect looked like a raft of logs compared with a steamboat that responds to the helm. Gladstone was a man of action, and silence to such is most becoming. He had a belief, that was enough. He should have hugged it close, and never stood up to explain it. Let us vary a simile just used. Lincoln once referred to an opponent as being like a certain steamboat that ran on the Sangamon. This boat had so big a whistle that when she blew it there wasn't steam enough to make her run, and when she ran she couldn't whistle. Huxley, Spencer, and Robert Ingersoll all made Gladstone cut for the woods and cover his retreat in a cloud of words. Ingersoll once said that in replying to Gladstone he felt like a man who had been guilty of cruelty to children. If one wants to see how pitifully weak Gladstone could be in an argument, let him refer to the North American Review for 1882. Yet Ingersoll was surely lacking in the passion for truth that characterized Huxley. Ingersoll was always a prosecutor or a defender. The lawyer habit was strong upon him. Just a little more bias in his clay, and he would have made a model bishop. His stock of science was almost as meagre as that of Samuel Wilberforce, and he seldom hesitated to turn the laugh on an adversary, even at the expense of truth. When brought to book for his indictment of Moses without giving that great man any credit for the sublime things he did do, or making allowances for the barbaric horde with which he had to deal, Bob evaded the proposition by saying, "I am not the attorney of Moses. He has more than 3,000,000 men looking after his case." Again, in that most charming lecture on Shakespeare, Ingersoll proves that Bacon did not write the plays, by picking out various detached passages of Bacon, which no one for a moment ever claimed revealed the genius of the man. With equal plausibility he could prove that the author of Hamlet was a weakling, by selecting all the obscure and stupid passages, and parading these with the unexplained fact that the play opens with the spirit of a dead man coming back to earth, and a little later in the same play Shakespeare has the man who interviewed the ghost tell of "that bourne from whence no traveller returns." Even Shakespeare was not a genius all the time. And Ingersoll, the searcher for truth, borrowed from his friends the priests the cheerful habit of secreting the particular thing that would not help the cause in hand. But one of the best things in Ingersoll's character was that he realized his lapses, and in private acknowledged them. On reading the smooth, florid, and plausible sophistry of Wilberforce, Ingersoll once said, "Be easy on Soapy Sam," A few years ago, a little shifting of base on the part of my ancestors, and I would probably have had Soapy Sam's job." This resemblance of opposites makes a person think of that remark applied to Voltaire: "He was the father of all those who wear shovel hats." When Thomas Huxley and his wife arrived in New York in 1876 on a visit to the Centennial Exhibition, this interesting item was flashed over the country: "Huxley and his titled bride have arrived in New York on their wedding journey." This item caused Mr. and Mrs. Huxley, both of them Royal Democrats, more joy than did the most complimentary interview. At home they had left a charming brood of 7 children, 3 of them nearly grown-ups. Huxley sent Tyndall, who a few months before had married a daughter of Lord Hamilton, the clipping and this note: "You see how that once I am in a democratic country, I am pulling all the honours I can in my own direction." The next letter the Huxleys received from Tyndall was addressed "Sir Thomas and Lady Huxley." Huxley never stood in much awe of the nobility. He evidently felt that there was another kind of which he himself in degree was heir. Huxley never had a better friend than Sir Joseph Hooker, and we see in his letters such postscripts as this: "Dear Sir Joseph, do come and dine with us. It is a month since we have seen your homely old phiz." And Sir Joseph replies that he will be on hand the next Sunday evening, and offers this mild suggestion: "Scientific gents as has countenances as curdles milk should not cast aspersions on men made in image of Maker." The wordy duel between Huxley and Gladstone prompted Toole, the great comedian, to send a box of grease paints to Huxley with a note saying, "These are for you and Gladstone to use when you make up." It was a joke so subtle and choice that the Huxleys, always dear friends of Toole, laughed for a week. Poor Gladstone required a diagram when he heard of the procedure, and then, not being trepanned for the pleasantry, remarked that if Toole and Huxley collaborated on the stage, it would be eminently the proper thing, and in his mind there was little choice between them, both being fine actors. Later we hear of Huxley saying he thought of sending the box of grease paints to Gladstone, so the Premier could use them in making up with God. As for himself, he was like Thoreau, and never quarrelled with him. Huxley had many friendships with people seemingly outside of his own particular line of work. Henry Irving, the Reverend Dr. Parker, John Fiske, and Hall Caine once met at one of the Huxleys' tall teas, and Dr. Parker explained that he personally had no objection to visiting with sinners. For Parker, Huxley had a great admiration, and often attended the Thursday noon meeting at the Temple, to see and hear the greatest actor in England, a compliment which Parker much appreciated, otherwise he would not have repeated it. "If I ever take to the stage, I will play the part of Jakes or Touchstone," said Huxley. John Fiske, in his delightful essay on Huxley, said that in the Huxley home there was more jest, joke, and banter than in any other place in London. The air was surcharged with mirth, and puns, very often bad ones, were often tossed back and forth with great recklessness. At one time John Fiske was at the Huxleys, and the dual or multiple nature of man came up for discussion. Huxley spoke of how very often men who were gentle and charming in their homes were capable of great crimes, and of how, on the other hand, a man might pass in the world as a philanthropist, and yet in his household be a veritable autocrat and tyrant. Fiske then incidentally mentioned the case of Doctors Parker and Webster of Harvard, men of intellect and worth. These men brooded over a misunderstanding that grew into a grudge and eventually hatched murder. One worthy professor killed the other, cut up the body, and tried to burn it in a chemist's retort. Only the great difficulty of reducing the human body to ashes caused the murder to out, and brought about the hanging of a scientist of note. "Yes, I have thought of the difficulty of disposing of a dead body," said Huxley, solemnly, and often when on the point of committing murder, this was the only thing that made me hesitate." "Oh, Pater, we are ashamed of you," said his 3 lovely daughters in concert. Huxley's ability to joke and his appreciation of the ludicrous marked him, in the mind of John Fiske, as the greatest thinker of his time. The humorist knows values, and that is why he laughs. Sensibility is, in fact, the basic element of wit. Huxley's duties on the Rattlesnake were not in the line of science. His rank was assistant surgeon, but as sure enough surgeons were only sent out on bigger craft, he was the ship's doctor. With the captain's help the men were kept busy, but not too busy, and the food and regulations were such that about all Huxley had to do was to look upon his work and pronounce it good. As a physician, Huxley practised throughout his life the science of prevention. "With a prophetic vision, quite unconscious, my parents named me after that particular apostle I was to admire most," once said Huxley. He was a doubter by instinct, and approached the world of nature as if nothing were known about it. His work on the Medusa won him the recognition of the British Society, and this secured him the coveted surgeon's commission. 2 tragedies confront man on his journey through life: one when he wants a thing and cannot get it, the other when he gets the thing and finds he does not want it. Having secured his surgeon's commission, Huxley felt a strong repulsion towards devoting his life to the abnormal. "I am a scientist by nature, and my business is to teach," he wrote to his affianced wife. These were wise words which he had learned from her, but which he repeated, seemingly quite innocent of their source. We take our own wherever we find it. Miss Heathorn admired a surgeon, but loved a scientist, and Huxley, being a man, was making a heroic struggle to be what the young woman most wished. Love supplies an ideal, and that is the very best thing love does, with possibly an exception or two. So behold a ship's surgeon in London, full-fledged, refusing offers of position, and even declining to take a choice of ships, for such is the perversity of things animate and inanimate, that, when we do not want things, fate brings them to us on silver platters and begs us to accept. We win by indifference as much as by desire. I have declined to ship on board the Cormorant as head surgeon, and have applied to the University of Toronto for a position as Professor of Natural History. And so America had Huxley flung at her head. Toronto considered, and the Canadian sat on the case, and after considerable correspondence the vacant chair was given to a Professor Baldini, of the Whitby Ladies' College. It was a close call for Canada. Huxley had imagined that the New World offered special advantages to a rising young person of scientific bent, but now he secured a marriage license, and settled down as lecturer at the School of Mines. A little later he began to teach at the Royal College of Surgeons, with which institution he was to be connected the rest of his life, and fill almost any chair that happened to be vacant. From the time he was 27, Huxley never had to look for work. He was known as a writer of worth, and as a lecturer his services were in demand. He became president of the Geological and Ethnological Society, was appointed Royal Commissioner for the Advancement of Science, was a member of the London School Board, Secretary of the Royal Society, Lord Rector of the University of Aberdeen, President of the Royal Society, and refused an offer to become custodian of the British Museum, a life position, and where he had once applied for a clerkship. In letters to Darwin he occasionally signed his name with all titles added thus: Thomas Henry Huxley, M.B., M.D., Ph.D., LL.D., F.R.S. of Her Majesty's Navy. Huxley was a forceful and epigrammatic writer, and had a command of English second to no scientist that England has ever produced. He was the only one of his group who had a distinct literary style. As a speaker he was quiet, deliberate, decisive, sure, and he carried enough reserve caloric so that he made his presence felt in any assemblage before he said a word. In oratory it is personality that gives ballast. Of his 40 or so published books, Man's Place in Nature, Elementary Physiology, and Classification of Animals have been translated into many languages, and now serve as textbooks in various schools and colleges. Huxley is the founder of the so-called agnostic school, which has the peculiarity of not being a school. The word agnostic was given its vogue by Huxley. To superficial people it was quite often used synonymously with infidel and free thinker, both words of reproach. To Huxley it meant simply one who did not know, but wished to learn. The controlling impulse of Huxley's life was his absolute honesty. To pretend to believe a thing against which one's reason revolts, in order to better one's place in society, was to him the sum of all that was intellectually base. He regarded man as an undeveloped creature, and for this creature to lay the flattering unction to his soul that he was in special communication with the Infinite, and in possession of the secrets of the Creator, was something that in itself proved that man was as yet in the barbaric stage. Said Huxley, "As to the final truths of creation and destiny, I am an agnostic. I do not know, hence I neither affirm nor deny." Humour and common sense usually go together. Huxley had a goodly stock of both. When George Eliot died, there was very earnest but ill-directed effort made to have her body buried at Westminster Abbey. Huxley, being close to the Dean, serving with him on several municipal boards, was importuned by Spencer to use his influence toward the desired end. Huxley saw the incongruity of the situation, and in a letter that reveals the logical mind and the direct literary Huxley quality, he placed his gentle veto on the proposition, and thus saved the enemy the mortification of having to do so. Darwin is buried in Westminster Abbey, but this was not to be the final resting place of the dust of Mill, Tyndall, Spencer, George Eliot, or Huxley. These had all stood in the fore of the fight against superstition, and had both given and received blows. The pantheon of such battle-scarred heroes was to be the hearts of those who prize above all that earth can bestow the benison of the God within. "Above all else let me preserve my integrity of intellect," said Huxley. Here is Huxley's letter to Spencer. 4 Marlborough Place, December 1880. My dear Spencer, your telegram which reached me on Friday evening caused me great perplexity, inasmuch as I had been just talking to Morley, and agreeing with him that the proposal for a funeral in Westminster Abbey had a very questionable look to us, who desired nothing so much as that peace and honour should attend George Eliot to her grave. It can hardly be doubted that the proposal will be bitterly opposed, possibly, as happened in Mill's case with less provocation, with the raking up of past histories, about which the opinion, even of those who have least the desire or the right to be pharisaical, is strongly divided, and which had better be forgotten. With respect to putting pressure on the Dean of Westminster, I have to consider that he has some confidence in me, and before asking him to do something for which he is pretty sure to be violently assailed, I have to ask myself whether I really think it a right thing for a man in his position to do. Now I cannot say I do. However much I may lament the circumstance, Westminster Abbey is a Christian church, and not a pantheon, and the dean thereof is officially a Christian priest, and we ask him to bestow exceptional Christian honours by this burial in the Abbey. George Eliot is known not only as a great writer, but as a person whose life and opinions were in notorious antagonism to Christian practice in regard to marriage, and Christian theory in regard to dogma. How am I to tell the Dean that I think he ought to read over the body of a person who did not repent of what the Church considers mortal sin, a service not one solitary proposition of which she would have accepted for truth while she was alive? How am I to urge him to do that which, if I were in his place, I should most emphatically refuse to do? You tell me that Mrs. Cross wished for the funeral in the Abbey. While I desire to entertain the greatest respect for her wishes, I am very sorry to hear it. I do not understand the feeling which could create such a desire on any personal grounds, save those of affection, and the natural yearning to be near, even in death, those whom we have loved. And on public grounds, the wish is still less intelligible to me. One cannot eat one's cake and have it too. Those who elect to be free in thought and deed must not hanker after the rewards, if they are to be so called, which the world offers to those who put up with its fetters. Thus, however I look at the proposal, it seems to me to be a profound mistake, and I can have nothing to do with it. I shall be deeply grieved if this resolution is ascribed to any other motives than those which I have set forth in greater length than I intended. Ever yours very faithfully, T. H. Huxley. End of section 18.
Section 19 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 10, Part 1. John Tyndall. In my little book on Faraday, published in 1868, I have stated that he had but to will it to raise his income in 1832 to £5,000 a year. In 1836 the sum might have doubled. Yet this son of a blacksmith, this journeyman bookbinder, with his proud, sensitive soul, rejecting the splendid opportunities open to him, refusing even to think them splendid in presence of higher aims, cheerfully accepted from the Trinity House a pittance of £200 a year. John Tyndall. Tyndall was of high descent and lowly birth. His father was a member of the Irish Constabulary, and there were intervals when the boy's mother took in washing. But back of this the constable swore a faith, when the ale was right, that he was descended from an Irish king, and probably this is true, for most Irishmen are, and acknowledge it themselves. The father of our Tyndall spelled his name Tyndale, and traced a direct relationship to William Tyndale, who declared he would place a copy of the English Bible in the hands of every ploughboy in the British Isles, and pretty nearly made good his vow. William Tyndale paid for his privileges, however. He was arrested, given an opportunity to run away, but wouldn't. Then he was exiled. Finally, he was incarcerated in a dungeon of the Castle Vilvoorden. His cell was beneath the level of the ground, so it was cold and damp and dark. He petitioned the governor of the prison for a coat to keep him warm and a candle by which he could read. "We'll give you both light and heat pretty soon," was the reply. And they did. They led Tyndale out under the blue sky and tied him to a stake set in the ground. Around his feet they piled brush, and also all of his books and papers that they could find. A chain was put around his neck and hooked tight to the post. Then the faggots were piled high and the fire was lighted. "He was not burned to death," argued one of the priests who was present. "He was not burned to death. He just drew up his feet and hanged himself in the chain, and so was choked. He was that stubborn." The father of John Tyndall was an Orangeman and had in a glass case a bit of the flag carried at the Battle of the Boyne. It is believed with reason that the original flag had in it about 10,000 square yards of material. Tyndale the Orangeman was of so uncompromising a type that he occasionally arrested Catholics on general principles, like the Irishman who beat the Jew under the mistaken idea that he had something to do with crucifying our Savior. "But that was 2,000 years ago," protested the Jew. "Never mind, I just heard of it. Take that, and that." Zeal not wisely directed is a true Irish trait. It will not do to say that the Irish have a monopoly on stupidity, yet there have been times when I thought they nearly cornered the market. I had once charge of a gang of green Irishmen at a lumber camp. I started a night school for their benefit, as their schooling had stopped at subtraction. One evening they got it into their heads that I was an atheist. Things began to come my way. I concluded discretion was the better part of valor, and so took to the woods literally. They followed me for a mile and then gave up the chase. On the way home, they met a man who spoke ill of me, and they fell upon him and nearly pounded his life out. I never had to lick any of my gang, they looked after this themselves. On pay nights, they all got drunk and fell upon each other. Broken noses and black eyes were quite popular. Father Driscoll used to come around nearly every month and have them all sign the pledge. That story about the Irishman who ate the rind of the watermelon and threw the inside away is true. That is just what the Irish do. Very often they are not able to distinguish good from bad, kindness from wrong, love from hate. Ireland has all the freedom she can use or deserves, just as we all have. What would Ireland do with freedom if she had it? Hate for England keeps peace at home. Home rule would mean home roughhouse, and a most beautiful argument it would be, enforced with shillelagh logic. The spirit of Donnybrook Fair is there today as much as ever, and wherever you see a head, hit it would be home rule. Donnybrook is a condition of mind. If England really had a grudge against Ireland and wanted to get even, she could not do better than to set her adrift. But then the Irish impulsiveness sometimes leads to good, else how could we account for such men as O'Connor, Parnell, John Tyndall, Burke, Goldsmith, Sheridan, Arthur Wellesley, and all the other Irish poets, orators, and thinkers who have made us vibrate with our kind. Transplanted weeds produce our finest flowers. The parents of Tyndall were intent on giving their boy an education, and to them the act of committing things to memory was education. William Tyndale gave the Bible to the people. John Tyndall would force it upon them. The Book of Martyrs, the sermons of Jeremy Taylor, and the Bible little John came to know by heart, and he grew to have a fine distaste for all. Once, when nearly a man grown, he had the temerity to argue with his father that the Bible might be better appreciated if a bounty were not placed in disbelief in its divine origin. A cuff on the ear was the answer, and John was given until sundown to apologize. He did not apologize. And young Tyndale then vowed he would change his name to Tyndall and forever separate himself from a person whose religion was so largely mixed with brutality. But yet John Tyndale was not a bad man. He had intellect far above the average of his neighbors. He had the courage of his convictions. His son had the courage of his lack of convictions. In the early drilling in the Bible was a good thing for young Tyndall. Bible legend and allusion color the English language, and any man who does not know his Bible well can never hope to speak or write English with grace and fluency. Tyndall always knew and acknowledged his indebtedness to his parents, and he also knew that his salvation depended on getting away from and beyond the narrow confines of their beliefs and habits. Because a thing helps you in a certain period of your education is no reason why you should feed on it forevermore. This way lies arrested development. Life, like heat, is a mode of motion, and progress consists in discarding a good thing as soon as you've found a better. Occasionally, Herbert Spencer used to spend a Sunday afternoon with the Carlyles at their modest home in Chelsea. At such time, Jeanie Welsh would usually manage to pilot the conversational craft along smooth waters, but if she were not present, hot arguments would follow, and finally a point would be reached where Carlyle and Spencer would simply sit and glare at each other. After such scenes, I've always thought less of two persons, Carlyle and myself, said Spencer, and so for many years I very cautiously avoided Cheyne Row. Then there was another man Spencer avoided, although for a different reason. This individual was John Tyndall. On the death of Tyndall, Spencer wrote, "There has just died the greatest teacher of modern times, a man who stimulated thought in old and young, everyone he met, as no one else I knew ever did. Once we went together for a much-needed rest in the Lake District. Gossip, which has its advantages in that it can be carried on with no tax on one's intellectual powers, had no part in our conversation. The discussion of great themes began at once, wherever Tyndall was. The atmosphere of the man was intensely stimulating. Everybody seemed to become great and wise and good in his presence. We walked on the shores of Windermere, climbed Rydal Mount, rode across Lake Grasmere, leaving our names on the visitors' list, and all the time we dwelt upon high Olympus and talked. But alas, Tyndall's vivacity undid me. 2 days of his company, with 2 sleepless nights, and I fled him as I would a pestilence." But Carlyle growled out one thing in Spencer's presence which Spencer often quoted. "If I had my own way," said Carlyle, I would send the sons of poor men to college, and the sons of rich men I would send to work. Manual labor in right proportion means mental development. Too much hoe may slant the brow, but hoe in proper proportion develops the cerebellum. In the past, we've had one set of men do all the work, and another set had all the culture. One hoes and another thirsts. There are whole areas of brain cells which are evolved only through the efforts of hand and eye, for it is the mind, at last, that directs all our energies. The development of brain and body go together. Manual work is brain work. Too much brain work is just as bad as too much toil. The misuse of the pen carries just as severe a penalty as the misuse of the hoe. And it is great satisfaction to realize that the thinking world has reached a point where these propositions do not have to be proven. There was a time when Spencer regretted that he had not been sent to college, instead of being set to work. But later he came to regard his experience as a practical engineer and surveyor as a very precious and necessary part of his education. John Tyndall and Alfred Russel Wallace had an experience almost identical. In childhood, John attended the village school for 6 months of the year, and the rest of the time helped his parents, as children of poor people do. When 19, he went to work carrying a chain in their surveying corps. Steady attention to the business in hand brought its sure reward. In a few years, he had charge of the squad, and was given the duty of making maps and working out complex calculations in engineering. In mathematics, he especially excelled. 5 years in the employ of the Irish Ordnance Survey, and 3 years in practical railroad building, and Tyndall got the socialistic bee in his bonnet. He resigned a good position to take part in bringing about the millennium. That he helped the old world along toward the ideal, there is no doubt. But Tyndall is dead and Jerusalem is not yet. When the rule of the barons was broken, and the stage of individualism or competition was ushered in, men said, "Lo, the time is at hand, and now is." But it was not. Socialism is coming by slow degrees, imperceptibly almost as the growing of spring flowers to push their way from the damp, dark earth into the sunlight. And after socialism, what? Perhaps the millennium will still be a long way off. In 1847, when Tyndall was 27 years old, Robert Owen, one of the greatest practical men the world has ever seen, cried aloud, "The time is at hand!" Owen was an enthusiast, all great men are. He had risen from the ranks by the absolute force of great untiring, restless, and loving spirit. From a day laborer in a cotton mill, he had become principal owner of a plant that supported 5,000 people. Owen saw the difference between joyless labor and joyful work. His mills were clean, orderly, sanitary, and surrounded with lawns, trees, and shrubbery. He was the first man in England to establish kindergartens, and this he did at his own expense for the benefit of his helpers. He established libraries, clubs, swimming pools, night schools, lecture courses, and all this time his business prospered. To the average man, it is a miracle how any one individual could bear the heaviest business burdens and still do what Robert Owen did. Robert Owen had vitality plus. He was a gourmet for work. William Morris was just such a man, only with a bias for art, but both Owen and Morris had the intensity and impetus to get the thing done while common folks are thinking about it. Owen was familiar with every detail of his vast business, and he was an expert in finance. Like Napoleon, he said, "The finances? I will arrange them." Robert Owen erected schoolhouses, laid out gardens, built mills, constructed tenements, traveled, lectured, and wrote books. His enthusiasm was contagious. He was never sick. He could not spare the time. And a doctor once said, "If Robert Owen ever dies, it will be through too much Robert Owen." Owen went over to Dublin on one of his tours, and lectured on the ideal life, which to him was socialism, each for all and all for each. Fourier, the dreamer, supplied a good deal of the argument, but Robert Owen did the thing. Socialism always catches these two classes, doers and dreamers, workers and drones, honest men and rogues, those with a desire to give and those with a lust to get. Among others who heard Owen speak at Dublin was the young Irish engineer John Tyndall. Tyndall was the type of man that must be common before we can have socialism. There was not a lazy hair in his head, not a selfish one either. He had a tender heart, a receptive brain, and the spirit of obedience. The spirit that gives all without counting the cost. the spirit that hearkens to the God within. And need I say that the person who gives all gets all? The economics of God are very simple. We receive only that which we give. The only love we keep is the love we give away. These are very old truths. I did not discover nor invent them. They are not covered by copyright. Cast thy bread upon the waters. John Tyndall was melted by Owen's passionate appeal of each for all and all for each. To live for humanity seemed the one desirable thing. His loving Irish heart was melted. He sought Owen out at his hotel, and they talked till 3 o'clock in the morning. Owen was a judge of men. His success depended upon this one thing, as that of every successful business must. He saw that Tyndall was a rare soul and nearly fulfilled his definition of a gentleman. Tyndall had hope, faith, and splendid courage, but best of all, he had that hunger for truth which classes him forever among the sacred few. During his work out of doors on surveying trips, he had studied the strata, gotten on good terms with birds, bugs, and bees. He knew the flowers and weeds, and loved all the animate things of nature, so that he recognized their kinship to himself, and he hesitated to kill or destroy. Education is a matter of desire, and a man like Tyndall is getting an education wherever he is. All is grist that comes to his mill. Robert Owen had but recently started Queenswood College in Hampshire, and nothing would do but Tyndall should go there as a teacher of science. "Is he a skilled and educated teacher?" someone had asked Owen. "Better than that," replied Owen. "He is a regular firebrand of enthusiasm." And so Tyndall resigned his position with the railroad and moved over to England, taking up his home at Harmony Hall. Harmony Hall was a beautiful brick building, with the letters C.M. carved on the cornerstone in recognition of the commencement of the millennium. The pupils were mostly workers in the Owen mills who had shown some special aptitude for education. The pupils and teachers all worked at manual labor a certain number of hours daily. There was a delightful feeling of comradeship about the institution. Tyndall was happy in his work. He gave lectures on everything, and taught the things that no one else could teach, and of course he got more out of the lessons than any of the scholars. But after a few months' experience with the ideal life, Tyndall had common sense enough to see that Harmony Hall, instead of being the spontaneous expression of the people who shared its blessings, was really a charity maintained by one Robert Owen. It was a beneficent autocracy, a sample of one-man power, beautifully expressed. Robert Owen planned it, built it, directed it, and made good any financial deficit. Instead of socialism, it was a kindly despotism. A few of the scholars did their level best to help themselves and help the place, but the rest didn't think and didn't care. They were passengers who enjoyed the cushioned seats. A few, while partaking of the privileges of the place, denounced it. "You cannot educate people who do not want to be educated," said Tyndall. "The value of an education lies in the struggle to get it. Do too much for people, and they will do nothing for themselves." Many of the students at Harmony Hall had been sent there by Owen, because he, in the greatness of his heart and the blindness of his zeal, thought they needed education. They may have needed it, but they did not want it. Ease was their aim. The indifference and ingratitude Robert Owen met with did not discourage him. It only gave him an occasional pause. He thought that the bad example of English society was too close to his experiments. It vitiated the atmosphere. So he came over to America and founded the town of New Harmony, Indiana. The fine solid buildings he erected in Posey County, then a wilderness, are still there. As for the most romantic and interesting history of New Harmony, Robert Owen and his socialistic experiments, I must refer the gentle reader to the Encyclopedia Britannica, a work I have found very useful in the course of making my original researches. After a year at Harmony Hall, Tyndall saw that he would have to get out, or else become a victim of arrested development, through too much acceptance of a strong man's bounty. "You cannot afford to accept anything for nothing," he said. Life at Harmony Hall to him was very much like life in a monastery, to which stricken men flee when the old world seems too much for them. When all the people live the ideal life, I'll live it. But until then, I'm only one of a great many strugglers. Besides, he felt that in missing university training, he had dropped something out of his life. Now he would go to Germany and see for himself what he had missed. While railroading, he had saved up nearly £4,000. This money he had offered at one time to invest in shares in the Owen Mills, but Robert Owen said, "Wait 2 years and then see how you feel." Robert Owen was not a financial exploiter. Tyndall may have differed with him in a philosophic way, but they never ceased to honor and respect each other. And so John Tyndall bade the ideal life goodbye and went out into the stress, strife, and struggle, resolved to spend his $2,000 in bettering his education and then to start life anew. End of section 19. Section 20. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter 10, Part 2. Robert Owen had been over to America and had met Emerson, and very naturally caught it. When he returned home, he gave young Tyndall a copy of Emerson's first book, The Essay on Nature, published anonymously. Tyndall read and reread the book, and read it aloud to others, and spoke of it as a message from the gods. He also read every word that Carlyle put in print. It was Carlyle who introduced him to German philosophy and German literature, and fired him with a desire to see for himself what Germany was doing. Germany had still another mystic tie that drew him thitherward. It was at Marburg, Germany, that his illustrious namesake had published his translation of the Bible. At Marburg there was a university, small 'twas true, but its simplicity and the cheapness of living there were recommendations. So to Marburg he went. Tyndall found lodgings in a little street called Heretics' Row. Possibly there be people who think that Tyndall's taking a room in such a street was chance, too. Chance is natural law not understood. Marburg is a very lovely little town that clings amid a forest of trees to the rocky hillside overlooking the river Lahn. Tyndall was very happy at Marburg, and at times very miserable. The beauty of the place appealed to him. He was a climber by nature, and the hills were a continual temptation. But the language was new, and before this his work had been all of a practical kind. College seems small and trivial after you've been in the actual world of affairs. But Tyndall did not give up. He rose every morning at 6, took his cold bath, dressed, and ran up the hill half a mile and back. He breakfasted with the family that he might talk German. Then he dived into differential calculus and philosophical abstrusities. He was not sent to college, he went. And he made college give up all it had. On the wall of his room, as a sort of ornamental frieze in charcoal, he wrote this from Emerson: "High knowledge and great strength are within the reach of every man who unflinchingly enacts his best." Down in the town was a bronze bust of a man who wrote for it the following inscription: "This is the face of a man who has struggled energetically." One might almost imagine that Hawthorne had received from Tyndall the hint which evolved itself into that fine story, The Great Stone Face. The bust just mentioned attracted John Tyndall for another reason. Carlyle had written of the man it symboled, "Reader, to thee thyself even now he has one counsel to give, the secret of his whole poetic alchemy. Think of living, thy life. Wert thou the pitifullest of all sons on earth? Is no idle dream, but a solemn reality. It is thy own, it is all thou hast, with which to front eternity. Work, then, even as he has done, like a star, unhasting and unresting." At Marburg, Tyndall was on good terms with the great Bunsen, and used to act as his assistant in making practical chemical experiments before his classes. These amazing things done by chemists in public are seldom of much value beyond giving a thrill to visitors who would otherwise drowse. It is like humor in an oration. It opens up the mental pores. Alexander Humboldt once attended a Bunsen lecture at Marburg and complimented Tyndall by saying, "When I take up sleight of hand work, consider yourself engaged as my first helper." Tyndall's way of standing with his back to the audience, shutting off the view of Bunsen's hands while he was getting ready to make an artificial peal of thunder, made Humboldt laugh heartily. Humboldt thought so well of the young man who spoke German with an Irish accent that he presented him with an inscribed copy of one of his books. The volume was a most valuable one, for Humboldt published only in deluxe limited editions, and Tyndall was so overcome that all he could say was, "I'll do as much for you some day." Not long after this, through loaning money to a fellow student, Tyndall found himself sadly in need of funds, and borrowed £2 on the book from an Hebrew Jew. That night he dreamed that Humboldt found the volume in a second-hand store. In the morning Tyndall was waiting for the pawnbroker to open his shop to get the book back ere the offense was discovered. Heinrich Heine once inscribed a volume of his poems to a friend, and afterward discovered the volume on the counter of a second-hand dealer. He thereupon haggled with the bookman, bought the book, and beneath his first inscription wrote, "With the renewed regards of H. Heine." He then sent the volume for the second time to his friend. 'Tis possible that Tyndall had heard of this. In 1850, when Tyndall was 30 years of age, he visited London and of course went to the British Institution. There he met Faraday for the first time and was welcomed by him. The British Institution consists of a laboratory, a museum, and a lecture hall, and its object is scientific research. It began in a very simple way in one room and now occupies several buildings. It was founded by Benjamin Thompson, an American, and so it was but proper that its sister concern, the Smithsonian Institution, should have been founded by an Englishman. Sir Humphrey Davy, on being asked, "What is your greatest discovery?" replied, "Michael Faraday." But this was a mere pleasantry, the truth being that it was Michael Faraday who discovered Sir Humphrey Davy. Faraday was a bookbinder's apprentice, a fact that should interest all good Roycrofters. Evenings, when Sir Humphrey Davy lectured at the British Institution, the young bookbinder was there. After the lecture he would go home and write out what he had heard, with a few ideas of his own added. For it be known, taking notes at a lecture is a bad habit. Good reporters carry no notebooks. After a year, Faraday sent a bundle of his impressions and criticisms to Sir Humphrey Davy anonymously. Great men seldom read manuscript that is sent to them unless it refers to themselves. At the next lecture, Sir Humphrey began by reading from Faraday's notes, and begged that if the writer were present, he would make himself known at the close of the address. From this was to ripen a love like that of father and son. Every man who builds up such a work as did Sir Humphrey Davy is appalled, when he finds time furrowing his face and whitening his hair, to think how few indeed there are who can step in and carry his work on after he is gone. The love of Davy for the young bookbinder was almost feverish. He clutched at this bright, impressionable, and intent young man who entered so into the heart and soul of science. Nothing would do but he must become his assistant. "Give up all and follow me," and Faraday did. Something of the same feeling must have swept over Faraday after his work of 25 years as director of the British Institution, when John Tyndall appeared tall, thin, bronzed, animated, quoting Bunsen and Humboldt with an Irish accent. And so in time Tyndall became assistant to Faraday, then lecturer in natural history, and when Faraday died, Tyndall, by popular acclaim, was made Fullerian lecturer and took Faraday's place. This was to be his life work, and so placed before the world that all he said or did had a wide significance and an extended influence. Tyndall was always a most intrepid mountain climber. The Alps lured him like the song of the Lorelei, and the wonder was that his body was not left in some mountain crevasse. "The most beautiful and poetic of all burials," he once said. But for him this was not to be, for fate is fond of irony. The only man who ever braved the full dangers of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado was killed by a suburban train in Chicago while on his wedding tour. Most bad men die in bed, tenderly cared for by trained nurses in white caps and big aprons. Tyndall climbed to the summit of the Matterhorn, ascended the so-called inaccessible peak of the Weisshorn, scaled Mont Blanc 3 times, and once was caught in an avalanche, riding toward death at the rate of a mile a minute. Yet he passed away from an overdose of a wrong dose of medicine given him through mistake by the hands of the woman he loved most. At one time Tyndall attempted to swim a mountain torrent. The stream, as if angry at his Irish assurance, tossed him against the rocks, brought him back in fierce eddies, and again threw him against a solid face of stone. When he was rescued, he was a mass of bruises, but fortunately no bones were broken. It was some days before he could get out, and in his sorry plight, bandaged so his face was scarcely visible. Spencer found him. "Herbert, do you believe in the actuality of matter?" was John's first question. Both Tyndall and Huxley made application to the University of Toronto for positions as teachers of science, but Toronto looked askance, as all pioneer people do, at men whose college careers have been mostly confined to giving college absent treatment. Herbert Spencer avowed again and again that Tyndall was the greatest teacher he ever knew or heard of, inspiring the pupil to discover for himself, to do, to become, rather than imparting prosy facts of doubtful pith and moment. But Herbert Spencer, not being eligible to join a university club himself, was possibly not competent to judge. Anyway, England was not so finical as Canada, and so she gained what Canada lost. Tyndall paid a visit to the United States in the year 1872 and lectured in most of the principal cities and at all the great colleges. He was a most fascinating speaker, fluent, direct, easy, and his whole discourse was well seasoned with humor. Whenever he spoke, the auditorium was taxed to its utmost, and his reception was very cordial even in colleges that were considered exceedingly orthodox. Possibly some good people who invited him to speak did not know it was loaded, and so his earnest words in praise of Darwin and the doctrine of evolution occasionally came like unto a rumble of his own artificial thunder. "I speak what I think is truth, but of course when I express ungracious facts, I try to do so in what will be regarded as not a nasty manner," said Tyndall, thus using that pet English word in a rather pleasing way. In his statement that the prayer of persistent effort is the only prayer that is ever answered, he met with a direct challenge at Oberlin. This gave rise to what, at the time, created quite a dust in the theological road, and evolved the Tyndall prayer test. Tyndall proposed that 100 clergymen be delegated to pray for the patients in any certain ward of Bellevue Hospital. If, after a year's trial, there was a marked decrease in mortality in that ward, as compared with previous records, we might then conclude that prayer was efficacious, otherwise not. One good clergyman in Pittsburgh offered publicly to debate Darwinism with Tyndall, but beyond a little scattered shrapnel of this sort, the lecture tour was a great success. It netted just $13,000, the whole amount of which Tyndall generously donated as a fund to be used for the advancement of natural science in America. In 1885, this fund had increased to $32,000 and was divided into 3 equal parts and presented to Columbia, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania. The fund was still further increased by others who'd followed Professor Tyndall's example, and Columbia, from her share of the Tyndall Fund, I am told now supports 2 foreign scholarships for the benefit of students who show a special aptitude in scientific research. Professor James of Harvard once said, "The impetus to popular scientific study caused by Professor Tyndall's lectures in the United States was most helpful and fortunate. Speaking but for myself, I know I am a different man and a better man for having heard and known John Tyndall." When John Tyndall died in the year 1893, Spencer wrote, "It never occurred to Tyndall to ask what it was politic to say, but simply to ask what was true. The like has of late years been shown in his utterances concerning political matters, shown, it may be, with too great frankness. This extreme frankness was displayed also in private, and sometimes perhaps too much displayed, but everyone must have the defects of his qualities. Where absolute sincerity exists, it is certain now and then to cause an expression of a feeling or opinion not adequately restrained. But the contrast in genuineness between him and the average citizen was very conspicuous. In a community of Tyndalls, to make a rather wild supposition, there would be none of that flabbiness characterizing current thought and action, no throwing overboard of principles elaborated by painful experience in the past, and adoption of a hand-to-mouth policy unguided by any principle. He was not the kind of man who would have voted for a bill or clause which he secretly believed would be injurious, out of what is euphemistically called party loyalty, or would have endeavored to bribe each section of the electorate by ad captum measures, or would have hesitated to protect life and property for fear of losing votes. What he saw right to do he would have done, regardless of proximate consequences. The ordinary tests of generosity are very defective. As rightly measured, generosity is great in proportion to the amount of self-denial entailed, and where ample means are possessed, large gifts often entail no self-denial. Far more self-denial may be involved in the performance on another's behalf of some act that requires time and labor. In addition to generosity under its ordinary form, which Professor Tyndall displayed in unusual degree, he displayed it under a less common form. He was ready to take much trouble to help friends. I've had personal experience of this. Though he had always in hand some investigation of great interest to him, and though, as I've heard him say, when he bent his mind to the subject he could not with any facility break off and resume it again, yet, when I have sought scientific aid, information, or critical opinion, I've never found the slightest reluctance to give me his undivided attention. Much more markedly, however, was this kind of generosity shown in another direction. Many men, while they are eager for appreciation, manifest little or no appreciation of others, and still less go out of their way to express it. With Tyndall it was not thus. He was eager to recognize achievement, notably in the case of Michael Faraday, and less notably, though still conspicuously in many cases, he has bestowed much labor and sacrificed many weeks in setting forth the merits of others. It was evidently a pleasure to him to dilate on the claims of fellow workers. But there was a derivative form of this generosity calling for still greater eulogy. He was not content with expressing appreciation of those whose merits were recognized, but he used energy unsparingly in drawing the attention of the public to those whose merits were unrecognized. Time and time, in championing the cause of such, he was regardless of the antagonism he aroused and the evil he brought upon himself. This chivalrous defense of the neglected and ill-used has been, I think by few, if any, so often repeated. I have myself more than once benefited by his determination, quite spontaneously shown, that justice should be done in the apportionment of credit, and I have with admiration watched like actions of his in other cases in which no consideration of nationality or of creed interfered in the least with his insistence on equitable distribution of honors. In this undertaking to fight for those who were unfairly dealt with, he displayed in another direction that very conspicuous trait, which, as displayed in his Alpine feats, has made him to many persons chiefly known. I mean courage, passing very often into daring. And here let me, in closing this little sketch, indicate certain mischiefs which this trait brought upon him. Courage grows by success. The demonstrated ability to deal with dangers produces readiness to meet more dangers, and is self-justifying where the muscular power and the nerve habitually prove adequate. But the resulting habit of mind is apt to influence conduct in other spheres, where muscular power and nerve are of no avail, is apt to cause the daring of dangers which are not to be met by strength of limb or by skill. Nature, as externally presented by precipice, ice slopes, and crevasses, may be dared by one who is adequately endowed, but nature, as internally represented in the form of physical constitution, may not be thus dared with impunity. Prompted by high motives, John Tyndall tended too much to disregard the protests of his body. Over-application in Germany caused absolute sleeplessness at one time. I think he told me for more than a week, and this, with kindred transgressions, brought on that insomnia by which his afterlife was troubled, and by which his power for work was diminished. For, as I've heard him say, a sound night's sleep was followed by a marked exaltation of faculty. And then, in later life, came the daring which, by its results, brought his active career to a close. He conscientiously desired to fulfill an engagement to lecture at the British Institution, and he was not deterred by fear of consequences. He gave the lecture, notwithstanding the protest which for days before his system had been making. The result was a serious illness, threatening, as he had thought at one time, a fatal result, and notwithstanding a year's furlough for the recovery of health, he was eventually obliged to resign his position. But for this defiance of nature, there might have been many more years of scientific exploration, pleasurable to himself and beneficial to others, and he might have escaped that invalid life for which for a long time he had to bear. In this case, however, the penalties of invalid life had great mitigations such as fall to the lot of few. It is conceivable that the physical discomforts and mental weariness which ill health brings may be almost, if not quite, compensated by the pleasurable emotions caused by unflagging attentions and sympathetic companionship. If this ever happens, it happened in his case. All who've known the household during these years of nursing are aware of the unmeasured kindness he has received without ceasing. I happen to have had special evidence of this devotion on the one side and gratitude on the other, which I do not think I am called upon to keep to myself, but rather to do the contrary. In a letter I received from him some half-dozen years ago, referring among other things to Mrs. Tyndall's self-sacrificing care of him, occurred this sentence: "She has raised my ideal of the possibilities of human nature." End of section 20.
Section 21 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter Alfred R. Wallace, Part 1. Alfred R. Wallace. Amok is an innovation which I do not recommend. It consists in letting go when things get too bad, and doing damage with tongue, hands, and feet. It is the tantrum carried to its logical conclusion. I saw one instance where a henpecked husband ran amok and killed or wounded 17 people before he himself was killed. It is the national and therefore the honorable mode of committing suicide among the natives of Celebes, and is the fashionable way of escaping from their difficulties. A man cannot pay. He is taken for a slave, or has gambled away his wife or child into slavery. He sees no way of recovering what he has lost, and becomes desperate. He will not put up with such cruel wrongs, but will be revenged on mankind and die like a hero. He grasps his knife, and the next moment draws out the weapon and stabs a man to the heart. He runs on with bloody kriss in his hand, stabbing every one he meets. Amok! Amok! Then resounds through the streets. Spears, krisses, knives, guns, and clubs are brought out against him. He rushes madly forward, kills all he can, men, women, and children, and dies, overwhelmed by numbers amid all the excitement of a battle. Alfred Russel Wallace, in the Malay Archipelago. Alfred R. Wallace. The question of how this world and all the things in it were made has, so far as we know, always been asked. And volunteers have at no time been slow about coming forward and answering. For this service the volunteer has usually asked for honors, and also exemption from toil, more or less unpleasant. He has also demanded the joy of riding in a coach, being carried in a palanquin, and sitting on a throne clothed in purple vestments trimmed with gold lace or costly furs. Very often the volunteer has also insisted on living in a house larger than he needed, having more food than his system required, and drinking decoctions that are costly, spicy, and peculiar. All of which luxury has been paid for by the people, who are told that which they wish to hear. The success of the volunteer lies in keeping one large ear close to the turf. Religious teachers have ever given their people a cosmogony that was adapted to their understanding. Who made it? God made it all. How long a time? 6 days. And then followed explanations of what God did each day. Over against the volunteers with a taste for power and fine corkscrew discrimination, there have been at rare intervals men with a desire to know for the sake of knowing. They were not content to accept any man's explanation. The only thing that was satisfying to them was the consciousness that they were inwardly right. Loyalty to the God within was the guiding impulse of their lives. In the past, such men have been regarded as eccentric, unreliable, and dangerous, and the volunteers have ever warned their congregations against them. Indeed, until a very few years ago, they were not allowed to express themselves openly. Laws have been passed to suppress them, and dire penalties have been devised for their benefit. Laws against sacrilege, heresy, and blasphemy still ornament our statute books. But these invented crimes that were once punishable by death are now obsolete, or exist in rudimentary forms only, and manifest themselves in a refusal to invite the guilty party to our 4 o'clock. This hot intent to support and uphold the volunteers in their explanations of how the world was made is a universal manifestation of the barbaric state, and is based upon the assumption that God is an infinite George IV. 600 years before Christ, Anaximander the Greek taught that animal life was engendered from the earth through the influence of moisture and heat, and that life thus generated gradually evolved into higher and different forms. All animals once lived in the water, but some of them becoming stranded on land put forth organs of locomotion and defense through their supreme resolve to live. Anaximander also taught that man was only a highly developed animal, and his source of life was the same as that of all other animals, man's present high degree of development having gradually come about through growth from very lowly forms. Anaxagoras, the schoolmaster of Pericles, also made similar statements, and then we find him boldly putting forth the very startling idea that between the highest type of Greek and the lowest type of savage there was a greater difference than between the savage and the ape. He also taught that the earth was the universal mother of all living things, animal and vegetable, and that the fecundation of the earth took place from minute, unseen germs that floated in the air. According to modern science, Anaxagoras was very close upon the trail of truth, but there were only a very few who could follow him, and it took the combined eloquence and tact of Pericles to keep his splendid head in the place where nature put it. And Pericles himself was compromised by his leaning toward Darwinism. Every man who speaks expresses himself for others. We succeed only as our thought is echoed back to us by others who think the same. If you like what I say, it is only because it is already yours. Moreover, thought is a collaboration and is born of parents. If a teacher does not get a sympathetic hearing, one of two things happens. He loses the thread of his thought and grows apathetic, or he arouses an opposition that snuffs out his life. And the dead, they soon grow cold. The recipe for popularity is to hunt out a weakness of humanity and then bank on it. No one knows this better than your theological volunteer. Aristotle, the father of natural history, who early in life had a Pegasus killed under him, taught that the diversity in animal life was caused by a diversity of conditions and environment, and he declared he could change the nature of animals by changing their surroundings. This being true, he argued that all animals were once different from what they are now, and that if we could live long enough, we would see that species are exceedingly variable. To explain to child minds that a supreme being made things outright just as they are is easy, but to study and in degree know how things evolved requires infinite patience and great labor. It also means small sympathy from the indifferent, whom the earth has spawned in swarms, and the hatred of the volunteers who ride in coaches and tell the many what they wish to hear. The volunteers drove Aristotle into exile, and from his time they had their way for 2,000 years, when John Ray, Linnaeus, and Buffon appeared. In 1755, Immanuel Kant, the little man who stayed near home and watched the stars tumble into his net, put forth his theory that every animal organism in the world was developed from a common original germ. In 1794, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, inspired by Kant and Goethe, put forth his book, Zoonomia, wherein he maintained the gradual growth and evolution of all organisms from minute unseen germs. These views were put forth more as a poetic hypothesis than as a well-grounded scientific fact, so little attention was paid to Erasmus Darwin's books. The fanciful accounts of creation put forth by Moses 3,000 years before were firmly maintained by the entrenched volunteers and their millions of devotees and followers. But Kant, Goethe, Karl von Baer, and Auguste de Saint-Hilaire were now planting their outposts throughout the civilized world, honeycombing Christendom with doubt. In the year 1852, Herbert Spencer had argued in public and in pamphlets that species have undergone changes and modifications through change of surroundings, and that the account of Noah and his ark with pairs of everything that flew, crept, or ran, was fanciful and absurd as far as we cared to distinguish fact from fiction. Early in the year 1858, Charles Darwin received from his friend, Alfred Russel Wallace, a paper entitled On the Tendency of Varieties to Depart Indefinitely from the Original Type. At this time Darwin had in his hands of the secretary of the Linnaeus Society a paper entitled On the Tendency of Species to Form Varieties, or the Perpetuation of Species and Varieties by Means of Natural Selection. The similarity in title, as well as the similarity in treatment of the Wallace theme, startled Darwin. He had been working on the idea for 20 years and had an immense mass of data bearing on the subject, which he someday intended to issue in book form. His paper for the Linnaeus Society simply summed up his convictions. And now here was a man with whom he had never discussed this particular subject, writing an almost identical paper and sending it to him, of all men. Well, did he pinch his leg and call in his wife, asking her if he were alive or dead? Straightway he went to see Sir Charles Lyell and Sir Joseph Hooker, both more eminent than he in the scientific world, and laid the matter before them. After a long conference, it was decided that both papers should be read the same evening before the Linnaeus Society, and this was done on the evening of July 1st, 1858. Darwin then decided to publish his Origin of Species, which in his preface he modestly calls an abstract. The publication was hastened by the fact that Wallace was compiling a similar work. After giving Wallace full credit in his most interesting introduction, and reviewing all that others had said in coming to similar conclusions, Darwin fired his shot heard round the world, and no man was more delighted and pleased with the echoing reverberations than Alfred Russel Wallace, as he read the book in far-off Australia. The honor of discovering the law of evolution and lifting it out of the hazy realms of hypothesis and poetry and into the sunlight of science will ever be shared between Charles Robert Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, who were indeed brothers in spirit and lovers to the end of their days. In an insignificant village of England, now famous alone because he began from there his explorations of the world, Alfred Russel Wallace was born in the year 1822. He was one of a large family of the middle class, where work is as natural as life, and the indispensable virtues are followed as a means of self-preservation. It is most unfortunate to attain such a degree of success that you think you can waive the Decalogue and give Nemesis the slip. About the year 1840, the railroad renaissance was on in England, and young Wallace, alive, alert, active, did his turn as apprentice to a surveyor. Chance is a better schoolmaster than design. All boys have a taste for tent life, and healthy youngsters, not quite grown, with ostrich digestions, passing through the nomadic stage, revel in hardships and count it a joy to sleep on the ground where they can look up at the stars and eat out of a skillet. A little later we find Alfred working for his elder brother in an architect's office, gazing abstractedly out of the window betimes, and wishing he were a ground squirrel, fancy-free on the heath, amid the heather, digging holes and thus avoiding introspection. Houses are prisons, he said, and sang softly to himself the song of the open road. I think I know exactly how Alfred Russel Wallace then felt, from the touchstone of my own experience. And I think I know how he looked, too, all confirmed by an East Aurora incident. Some years ago, one fine day in May, I was helping excavate for the foundation of a new barn. All at once, I felt that someone was standing behind me, looking at me. I turned around, and there was a tall, lithe, slender youth in a faded college cap, blue flannel shirt, ragged trousers, and top boots. My first impression of him was that he was a fellow who slept in his clothes, a plain weary. But when he spoke, there was a note of self-reliance in his low, well-modulated voice that told me he was no mendicant. Voice is the true index of character. My name is Wallace, and I have a note to you from my father. And he began diving into pockets, and finally produced a ragged letter that was nearly worn out through long contact with a perspiring human form divine, or partially so. I seldom make haste about reading letters of introduction, and so I greeted the young man with a word of welcome, and gave him a chance to say something for himself. He was English, that was very sure, and Oxford English at that. You see, he began, I am working just now over on the Hamburg and Buffalo electric line, stringing wires. I get $3 a day because I'm a fairly good climber. I wanted to learn the business, so I just hired out as a laborer, and they gave me the hardest job, thinking to scare me out. But that is what I wanted. And he smiled modestly and showed a set of incisors so fine and strong as a dog's teeth. I want to remain with you for a week, and pay for my board in work, he cautiously continued. But what about your father, Mr. Wallace? Do I know him? I think so. He has written you several letters. Alfred Russel Wallace. You could have knocked me down with a lady slipper. I opened the letter, and unmistakably it was from the great scientist, introducing my baby boy. I never met Alfred Russel Wallace, but I know if I should, I would find him very gentle, kindly, and simple in all his ways, as really great men ever are. He would not talk to me in Latin nor throw off technical phrases about great nothings, and I would feel just as much as home with him as I did with old John Burroughs the last time I saw him, leaning up against a country railroad station in shirt sleeves, chewing a straw, exchanging salutes with the engineer on a West Shore jerkwater. "So long, John," called the going one as he leaned out of the cab window. "So long, Bill, and good luck to you," was the cheery answer. But still, all of us have moments when we think of the world's most famous ones as being surely 8 feet tall and having voices like foghorns. I can do most any kind of hard work, you know. I was aroused from my little mental excursion and noticed my visitor had hair of a light yellow like a Swede from Hennepin County, Minnesota, and that his hair was 3 shades lighter than his bronzed face. "I can do any kind of work, you know, and if you will just loan me that pick," and I handed him the pickaxe. Young Wallace remained with us for a week, asking for nothing, doing everything, even to helping the girls wash dishes. That he was the son of a great man, no one would have ever learned from his own lips. In fact, I am not sure that he was impressed with his father's excellence, but I saw there was a tender bond between them, for he haunted the post office morning, noon, and night, looking for a letter from his father. When it came, he was happy as a woodchuck. He showed me the letter. It was 9 finely written pages. But to my disappointment, not a word about marsupials, siamons, or syndactyli, just news about John, William, Mary, and Benjamin, with references to chickens and cows, a new greenhouse, with a little good advice about keeping right hours and not overeating. The young man had spent 3 years at Oxford and was an electrical engineer. He was intent on finding out just as much about the secrets of American railroad construction as he possibly could. As for intellect, I did not discover any vast amount. Perhaps, for that matter, he didn't either. But we all enjoyed his visit, and when he went away, I presented him with a clean, second-hand flannel shirt and my blessing. From the appearance of the young man, I imagine that Alfred Russel Wallace, at 21, was very much such a man as his son, who did such good work at the Royal Croft with pick and shovel. Alfred was earnest, intense, strong, and had a great deal of quiet courage that he was as unconscious of as he was of his digestion. He taught school, and to interest his scholars he would take them on botanical excursions. Then he himself grew interested and began to collect plants, bugs, beetles, and birds on his own account. By 1848, the confining walls of the school had become intolerable to Wallace, and he started away on a wild goose chase to Brazil, with a chum by the name of Henry Walter Bates, an ardent entomologist. Alfred had no money either, but Bates had influence, and he cashed it in by arranging with the curator of the British Museum that any natural history specimens of value which they might gather and send to him would be paid for. And so something like £100 was collected from several scientific men and handed over as advance payment for the wonderful things that the young men were to send back. They embarked on a sailing vessel that was captained by a kind kinsman of Bates, so the fare was nil, in consideration of services rendered constructively. Arriving in Brazil, the young men began their collecting of specimens. They got together a very credible collection of birds' eggs, and sent them back by the captain of the ship they came out on, this as an earnest of what was to come. Bates and Wallace were together for a year. Bates insisted on remaining near the white settlements, but Wallace wanted to go where white men had never been. So alone he went into the forest, and for 2 years lived with the natives and dared the dangers of jungle fever, snakes, crocodiles, and savages. For a space of 10 months he did not see a single white person. He collected nearly 10,000 specimens of birds, which he skinned and carefully prepared so they could be mounted when he returned to England. There was also a nearly complete Brazilian herbarium, and a finer collection of birds' eggs than any museum of England could boast. The collection represented over 3 years' continuous toil. All the curious things were packed with great care and placed on board ship. And so the young naturalist sailed away for England, proud and happy, with his great collection of entomological, botanical, and ornithological specimens. But on the way the ship took fire, and the collection was either burned or ruined by soaking salt water. That the crew or their sole passenger escaped alive was a wonder. Wallace, on reaching England, was in a sorry plight, being destitute of clothes and funds. And there were unkind ones who did not hesitate to hint that he had only been over to Ireland working in a peat bog, and that his knowledge of Brazil was gotten out of Humboldt's books. In one way, Wallace surely paralleled Humboldt. Both lost a most valuable collection of natural history specimens by shipwreck. Several of the good men who had advanced money now asked that it be paid. Wallace set to work writing out his recollections, the only asset that he possessed. His book, Travel on the Amazon and Rio Negro, had enough romance in it so that it floated. Royalties paid over in crisp Bank of England notes made things look brighter. Another book was issued, called Palm Trees and Their Uses, and proved that the author was able to view a subject from every side and say all that was to be said about it. Wallace on the Palm is still a textbook. The debts were paid, and Alfred Russel Wallace at 30 was square with the world, the possessor of much valuable experience. He also had £500 in cash, with a reputation as a writer and traveler that no longer caused bookworms to sneeze. Having paid off his obligations, he felt free again to leave England, a thing he had vowed he would not do so long as his reputation was under a cloud. This time he selected for a natural history survey a section of the world really less known than South America. End of section 21. Section 22 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. Chapter Alfred R. Wallace, Part 2. Early in the year 1854, Alfred Russel Wallace reached Asia. He had decided that he would make the first and best collection of the flora and fauna of the Malay archipelago that it was possible to make. White men had skirted the coast of many of the islands, but information as to what there was inland was mostly conjecture and guesswork. Just how long it would take Wallace to make his Malaysian Natural History Survey he did not know, but in a letter to Darwin he stated that he expected to be absent from England at least 2 years. He was gone 8 years, and during this time walked, paddled, or rode horseback 15,000 miles, and visited many islands never before trod by the foot of a white man. The city of Singapore served him as a base or headquarters, because from there he could catch trading ships that plied among the islands of the archipelago, and to Singapore he could also ship and there store his specimens. From Singapore he made 60 separate voyages of discovery. In all, he sent home over 125,000 natural history specimens, including about 10,000 birds, which, later on, were all stuffed and mounted under his skillful direction. On returning to England, Wallace took 6 years in preparation of his book, The Malay Archipelago, a most stupendous literary undertaking, which covers the subjects of botany, geology, ornithology, entomology, zoology, and anthropology in a way that serves as a regular mine of information and suggestion for natural history workers. The book in its original form, I believe, sold for £10, $50, and was issued to subscribers in parts. It was bought not only by students, but by a great number of general readers, there being enough adventure mixed up in the science to spice what otherwise might be rather dry reading. For instance, there is a chapter about killing orangutans that must have served my old friend, Paul du Chaillu, as an excellent raw stock in compiling his own recollections. Wallace states that the only foe for which the orang really has a hatred is the crocodile. It seems to share with man a shuddering fear of snakes, although orangs have no part in making Kentucky famous. But the crocodile is his natural and hereditary enemy. And as if to get even with this ancient foe, who occasionally snaps off a young orang in his prime, the orangs will often locate a big crocodile and, jumping on his back, beat him with clubs, and when he opens his gigantic mouth, the female orangs will fill the cavity with sticks and stones, and keep up the fight until the crocodile succumbs and quits this vale of crocodile tears. The orang is distinct and different from the chimpanzee and gorilla, which are found only in Western Africa. In Borneo, the man-ape is quite numerous. This is the animal that has given rise to all those tales about the wild man of Borneo, which that good man, P.T. Barnum, kept alive by exhibiting a fine specimen. Barnum's original wild man lived at Waltham, Massachusetts, and belonged to the Baptist Church. He recently died worth $100,000, which money he left to found a school for young ladies. The orang, or mias, hides in the swampy jungles and rarely comes to the ground. The natives regard them as sort of a sacred object and have a great horror of killing them. Indeed, a person who kills a man-ape they regard as a murderer. So when Wallace announced to his attendants that he wanted to secure several specimens of these wild men of the woods, they cried, "Alas! He is making a collection. It will be our turn next," and they fled in terror. Wallace then hired another set of servants and resolved to make no confidants, but just go ahead and find his game. He had hunted for weeks through forest and jungle, but never a glimpse or sight of the man-ape. He had almost given up the search, and concluded with several English scientists that this orangutan was a part of that great fabric of pseudoscience invented by imaginative sailormen, who took most of their inland little journeys around the capstan. And so musing, seated in the doorway of his bamboo house, he looked out upon the forest, and there, only a few yards away, swinging from tree to tree, was a man-ape. It seemed to him to be about 5 times as large as a man. He seized his gun and approached. The beast stopped, glared, and railed at him in a voice of wrath. It broke off branches and threw sticks at him. Wallace thought of the offer made him by the South Kensington Museum. £100 in gold for an adult male, skin and skeleton to be properly preserved and mounted. £75 for a female. The huge animal showed its teeth, cast one glance of scornful contempt on the puny explorer, and started on, swinging 30 feet at a stretch and catching hold of the limbs with its 2 pairs of hands. Wallace grasped his gun and followed, lured by the demonic shape. A little of the superstition of the natives had gotten into his veins. He dare not kill the thing unless it came toward him, and he had to shoot it in self-defense. It traveled in the trees about as fast as he could on the ground. Occasionally it would stop and chatter at him, throwing sticks in a most human way, as if to order him back. Finally, the instincts of the naturalist got the better of the man, and he shot the animal. It came tumbling to the ground with a terrific crash, grasping at the vines and leaves as it fell. It was quite dead, but Wallace approached it with great caution. It proved to be a female of moderate size, in height about 3½ feet, 6 feet across from finger to finger. Needless to say that Wallace had to do the skinning and mounting of the skeleton alone. His servants had chills of fear if asked to approach it. The skeleton of this particular orang can now be seen in the Derby Museum. In a few hours after killing his first orang, Wallace heard a peculiar crying in the forest, and on search found a young one, evidently the baby of the one he had killed. The baby did not show any fear at all, evidently thinking it was with one of its kind, for it clung to him piteously, with an almost human tenderness. Says Wallace, "When handled or nursed, it was very quiet and contented, but when laid down by itself, would invariably cry, and for the first few nights was very restless and noisy. I soon found it necessary to wash the little mias as well. After I had done so a few times, it came to like the operation, and after rolling in the mud would begin crying, and continue until I took it out and carried it to the spout, when it immediately became quiet, although it would wince a little at the first rush of the cold water, and make ridiculously wry faces while the stream was running over its head. It enjoyed the wiping and rubbing dry amazingly, and when I brushed its hair it seemed to be perfectly happy, lying quite still with its arms and legs stretched out. It was a never-failing amusement to observe the curious changes of countenance by which it would express its approval or dislike of what was given to it. The poor little thing would lick its lips, draw in its cheeks, and turn up its eyes with an expression of the most supreme satisfaction, when it had a mouthful particularly to its taste. On the other hand, when its food was not sufficiently sweet or palatable, it would turn the mouthful about with its tongue for a moment, as if trying to extract what flavor there was, and then push it all out between its lips. If the same food was continued, it would proceed to scream and kick about violently, exactly like a baby in a passion. When I had had it about a month, it began to exhibit some signs of learning to run alone. When laid upon the floor, it would push itself along by its legs, or roll itself over, and thus make an unwieldy progression. When lying in the box, it would lift itself up to the edge in an almost erect position, and once or twice succeeded in tumbling out. When left dirty or hungry or otherwise neglected, it would scream violently till attended to, varied by a kind of coughing noise, very similar to that which is made by the adult animal. If no one was in the house, or its cries were not attended to, it would be quiet after a little while. But the moment it heard a footstep, would begin again harder than ever. It was very human. The most lasting result of the wanderings of Alfred Russel Wallace consists in his having established what is known to us as the Wallace Line. This line is a boundary that divides in a geographical way that portion of Malaysia which belongs to the continent of Asia from that which belongs to the continent of Australia. The Wallace Line covers a distance of more than 4,000 miles, and in this expanse there are 3 islands in which Great Britain could be set down without anywhere touching the sea. Even yet the knowledge of the average American or European is very hazy about the size and extent of the Malay archipelago, although through our misunderstanding with Spain, which loads us up with possessions we have no use for, we have recently gotten the geography down and dusted it off a bit. There is a book by Mrs. Rose Innes, wife of an English official in the Far East, who, among other entertaining things, tells of a headhunter chief who taught her to speak Malay, and she, wishing to reciprocate, offered to teach him English. But the great man begged to be excused, saying, "Malay is spoken everywhere you go, east, west, north, or south, but in all the world there are only 12 people who speak English," and he proceeded to name them. Our assumptions are not quite so broad as this, but few of us realize that the Protestant Christian religion stands fifth in the number of communicants, as compared with the other great religions, and that against our 100 millions of people in America, the Malay archipelago has over 200 millions. Wallace found marked geological, botanical, and zoological differences to denote this line, and from these things he proved that there had been great changes through subsidence and elevation of the land. At no very remote geologic period, Asia extended clear to Borneo, and also included the Philippine Islands. This is shown by the fact that animal and vegetable life in all of these islands is almost identical with life on the mainland. The same trees, the same flowers, the same birds, the same animals. As you go westward, however, you come to islands which have a very different flora and fauna, totally unlike that found in Asia, but very similar to that found in Australia. Australia, be it known, is totally different in all its animal and vegetable phenomenon from Asia. In Australia, until the white man very recently carried them across, there were no monkeys, apes, cats, bears, tigers, wolves, elephants, horses, squirrels, or rabbits. Instead, there were found animals that are found nowhere else, and which seem to belong to a different and so-called extinct geologic age, such as the kangaroo, wombats, the platypus, which the sailors used to tell us was neither bird nor beast, and yet was both. In birds, Australia also has very strange specimens, such as the ostrich, which cannot fly, but can outrun a horse and kills its prey by kicking forward like a man. Australia also has immense mound-making turkeys, honeysuckers, and cockatoos, but no woodpeckers, quail, or pheasants. Wallace was the first to discover that there are various islands, some of them several hundred miles from Australia, where the animal life is identical with that of Australia. And then there are islands, only a comparatively few miles away, which have all the varieties of birds and beasts found in Asia. But this line that once separated continents is in places but 15 miles wide, and is always marked by a deep water channel. But the seas that separate Borneo and Sumatra from Asia, although wide, are so shallow that ships can find anchorage anywhere. The Wallace line, proving the subsidence of the sea and upheaval of the land, has never been seriously disputed, and is to many students the one great discovery by which Wallace will be remembered. Wallace's book on the geographical distribution of animals sets forth in a most interesting manner the details of how he came to discover the line. It was in 1855 that Wallace, alone in the wilds of the Malay archipelago, became convinced of the scientific truth that species were in evolution from a common source, and he began making notes of his observations along this particular line of thought. Some months afterwards, he wrote out his belief in the form of an essay, but then he had no definite intention of what he would do with the paper, beyond keeping it for future reference when he returned to England. In the fall of 1857, however, he decided to send it to Darwin, to be read before some scientific society, if Darwin considered it worthy. And this paper was read on the evening of July the 1st, before the Linnaeus Society, with one by Darwin on the same subject, written before Wallace's paper arrived, wherein the identical views are set forth. Darwin and Wallace expressed what many other investigators had guessed or but dimly perceived. Of the 6 immortal modern scientists, 3 began life working as surveyors and civil engineers: Wallace, Tyndall, Spencer. From the number of eminent men, not forgetting Henry Thoreau, Leonardo da Vinci, Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant, Washington, nor old John Brown, who carried a Gunter's chain and manipulated the transit, we come to the conclusion that there must be something in the business of surveying that conduces to clear thinking and strong independent action. If I had a boy who by nature and habit was given to futilities, I would apprentice him to a civil engineer. When two gangs of men begin a tunnel, working towards each other from different sides of a mountain, dreams, poetry, hypothesis, and guesswork had better be omitted from the equation. Here is a case where metaphysics has no bearing. It is a condition that confronts them, not a theory. Theological explanations are assumptions built on hypotheses, and your theologian always insists that you shall be dead before you can know. If a bridge breaks down or a fireproof building burns to ashes, no explanation on the part of the architect can explain away the miscalculation, but your theologian always evolves his own fog, into which he can withdraw at will, thus making escape easy. Darwin, Huxley, Spencer, Tyndall, and Wallace all had the mathematical mind. Nothing but the truth would satisfy them. In school, you remember how we sometimes used to work on a mathematical problem for hours or days. Many would give it up. A few of the class would take the answer from the book, and in an extremity force the figures to give the proper result. Such students, it is needless to say, never gained the respect of either class or teacher, or themselves. They had the true theological instinct, but a few kept on until the problem was solved, or the fallacy of it had been discovered. In life school, such were the men just named, and the distinguishing feature of their lives was that they were students and learners to the last. Of this group of scientific workers, Alfred Russel Wallace alone survives, aged 89 at this writing, still studying, earnestly intent upon one of nature's secrets that 4 of his great colleagues years ago labeled unknown, and the other 2 marked unknowable. To some it is an anomaly and contradiction that a lover of science, exact, cautious, intent on certitude, should accept a belief in personal immortality. Still, to others, this is regarded as positive proof of his superior insight. All thinking men agree that we are surrounded by phenomena that to a great extent are unanalyzed, but Herbert Spencer, for one, thought it a lapse in judgment to attribute to spirit intervention mysteries which could not be accounted for on any other grounds. It was equal to that sin against science which Darwin committed, and which he atoned for in contrite public confession when he said, "It surely must be this, otherwise what is it? Hence we assume," and so on. Some recent writers have sought to demolish Wallace's argument concerning spiritism by saying he is an old man and in his dotage. Wallace once wrote a booklet entitled "Vaccination a Fallacy," which created a big dust in Doctors' Row, and was cited as corroborative proof, along with his faith in spiritism, that the man was mentally incompetent. But this is a deal worse excuse for argument than anything Wallace ever put forth. The real fact is that Wallace issued a book on spiritism in 1874, and in 1896 reissued it with numerous amendments, confirming his first conclusions. So he has held his peculiar views on immortality for over 30 years, and moreover his mental vigor is still unimpaired. Whether the proof he has received as to the existence of disembodied spirits is sufficient for others is very uncertain, but if it suffices for himself, it is not for us to quibble. Wallace agrees to allow us to have our opinions if we will let him have his. His views are in no sense those of Christianity. Rather, they might be called those of Theosophy, as the personal God and dogma of salvation and atonement are entirely omitted. The doctrine of evolution he carries into the realm of spirit. His belief is that souls reincarnate themselves many times for the ultimate object of experience, growth, and development. He holds that this life is the gateway to another, but that we should live each day as though it were our last. To this effect we find, in a recent article, Wallace quotes a little story from Tolstoy. A priest, seeing a peasant in a field plowing, approached him and asked, "How would you spend the rest of this day if you knew you were to die tonight?" The priest expected the man, who was a bit irregular in his church-going, to say, "I would spend my last hours in confession and prayer." But the peasant replied, "How would I spend the rest of the day if I were to die tonight? Why, I'd plow." Hence, Wallace holds that it is better to plow than to pray, and that in fact, when rightly understood, good plowing is prayer. All useful effort is sacred, and nothing else is or ever can be. Wallace believes that the only fit preparation for the future lies in improving the present. Please pass the dotage. End of section 22.
Section 23 of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynne Thompson. Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists by Elbert Hubbard. John Fiske. In a sinless and painless world, the moral element would be lacking. The goodness would have no more significance in our conscious life than that load of atmosphere which we are always carrying about with us. We are thus brought to a striking conclusion, the essential soundness of which cannot be gainsaid. In a happy world there must be pain and sorrow, and in a moral world the knowledge of evil is indispensable. The stern necessity for this has been proved to inhere in the most innermost constitution of the human soul. It is part and parcel of the universe. We do not find that evil has been interpolated into the universe from without. We find that, on the contrary, it is an indispensable part of the dramatic whole. God is the creator of evil, and from the eternal scheme of things, diabolism is forever excluded. From our present standpoint, we may fairly ask, what would have been the worth of that primitive innocence portrayed in the myth of the Garden of Eden, had it ever been realized in the life of men? What would have been the moral value or significance of a race of human beings ignorant of sin, and doing beneficent acts, with no more consciousness or volition than the deftly contrived machine that picks up raw material at one end, and turns out some finished product at the other? Clearly, for strong and resolute men and women, an Eden would be but a fool's paradise. Through Nature to God. John Fiske. Early in life John Fiske aimed high, and thought himself capable of great things. He also believed that the world accepted a man at the estimate he placed upon himself. Fiske was born at Hartford in 1842. His mother's maiden name was Fiske, and his father's name was Green, and until well nigh manhood John Fiske was called Edmund Green. His father died when Edmund was a baby, and the wee youngster was taken charge of by his grandmother Fiske of Middletown, Connecticut. When his mother married again, Edmund did not approve of the match. Parents often try to live their children's lives for them, and to hold the balance true, children occasionally attempt to dictate to parents in affairs of the heart. A young man by the name of Hamlet will be recalled who, having no special business of his own, became much distressed, and had theories concerning the conduct of his mother. As a general proposition, the person who looks after the territory directly under his own hat will find his time fairly well employed. They say Edmund Green made threats when his mother changed her name, but all he did was to follow her example and change his. Thereafter he was plain John Fiske. "I must have a name easy to take hold of, one that people can remember," he said. and they do say that John Fiske's reverence for John Ruskin had something to do with his choice of name. Just here some curious one of the curious sex, which, by the way, holds no monopoly on curiosity, may ask if the second venture of Mrs. Green was fruitful and fortunate. So I will say, yes, eminently so, and in one way it seemed to serve, for John Fiske's stepfather waived John's displeasure with his stepfather's wife, and did something towards sending the young man to Harvard University, and also supplied the funds to send him on a tour around the world. However, the second brood revealed no genius, at sight of which the defunct Mr. Green, from his seat in Elysium, must have chortled in glee, assuming, of course, that disembodied spirits are cognizant of the doings of their late partners, as John Fiske seemed to think they were. If Alexander Humboldt's mother had not married again, we would have had no Alexander Humboldt. Second marriages are like first ones in this: sometimes they are happy, and sometimes not. In any event, I occasionally think that mother love has often been much exaggerated. Love is a most beautiful thing, and it does not seem to make very much difference who supplies it. Stepmother love, Lincoln used to say, was the most precious thing that had ever come his way. I know a man who loves his mother-in-law because she pitied him. Our Oneida friends had community mothers, who took care of everybody's babies, just as if they were their own, and with marked success, for the genus hoodlum never evolved at Oneida. Grandmother love served all purposes for little Isaac Newton, just as it did for John Fiske. John Fiske's grandmother was his first teacher, and she started out with the assumption that genius always skips one generation. She believed that she was dealing with a record-breaker, and she was. What she did not know about the classics was known by others whom she delegated to teach her grandchild. When her baby genius was just out of linsey-woolsey dresses, and wore trousers buttoned to a calico waist, she began preparing him for college. The old lady had loved a college man in her youth, and she judged Harvard by the Harvard man she knew best. And the Harvard man she saw in her waking dreams she created in her own image. Harvard requires perspective, and viewed over the years through a mist of melancholy it is very beautiful. At close range we often get a Jarrett Bumble flavour of cigarettes, and a sight of the foam that made Milwaukee famous. To a great degree, Grandma Fiske created her Harvard out of the stuff that dreams are made of. When her little charge was 6 years old, she began preparing him for Harvard by teaching him to say, "Amo, amas, amat." At 7 years of age he was reading Caesar's Commentaries, and making wise comments over his bowl of bread and milk about the 10th Legion, and he also had his opinions concerning the relationship of Caesar with Cleopatra. At this time he read Josephus for rest, and discovered for himself that the famous passage about Jesus of Nazareth was an interpolation. When he was 8 he was familiar with Plato, had read all of Shakespeare's plays, and propounded a few hypotheses concerning the authorship of the sonnets. At 9 he spoke Greek with an Attic accent. When 10 he had read Prescott, Gibbon, and Macaulay, and about this time, as a memory test, he wrote the history of the world from the time of Moses down to the date of his own birth, giving a list of the greatest men who had ever lived, with a brief mention of what they had done, with the date of their birth and death. This book is still in existence, and so far as I know has never been equalled by the performance of any infant prodigy, save possibly John Stuart Mill. When 12 years of age he had read Virgil, Sallust, Tacitus, Ovid, Juvenal, and Catullus. He had also mastered trigonometry, surveying navigation, geometry, and differential calculus. Before his grandmother had him discard knee-breeches, he kept his diary in Spanish, spoke German at the table, and read German philosophy in the original. The year he was 16 he wrote poems after Dante in Italian, and translated Cervantes into English. At 17 he read the Hebrew Scriptures like a rabbi, and was familiar with Sanskrit. Now let no carpist imagine I have dealt in hyperbole, or hand-illuminated the facts. I have merely stated some simple truths about the early career of John Fiske. One might imagine that with all his wonderful achievements this youth would be top-heavy and a most insufferable prig. The fact was, he was a fine, rollicking, healthy young man, much given to pranks, and withal generous and lovable. He was admitted to Harvard without examination, for his fame had preceded him. Students and professors alike looked at him in wonder. At Cambridge, as if to keep good his record, he studied 13 hours a day for 12 months in the year. He ranged through every subject in the catalogue, and all recorded knowledge was to him familiar. Prophecies were freely made that he would eclipse Sir Isaac Newton and Humboldt, but there were others who had a clearer vision. John Fiske made a decided success in life, and left his personality distinctly impressed upon his time, but it is no disparagement to say of him that autumn did not fulfil the promise of spring. And Fiske himself, in his single original contribution to the evolution crusade, explains the reason why. Professor Santayana of Harvard once said that John Fiske made 3 great scientific discoveries, as followed: 1. As you lengthen a pigeon's bill, you increase the size of its feet. 2. White tomcats with blue eyes are always deaf. 3. The extent of mental development in any animal is in proportion to its infancy or the length of time involved in its reaching physical maturity. Waiving numbers 1 and 2 as of doubtful value, number 3 is Fiske's sole original discovery, according to his confession. Further, Huxley quotes Fiske on this theme, and adds, "The delay of adolescence and the prolonging of the period of infancy form a subject, as expressed by Mr. Fiske, which is worthy of our most careful consideration." Rare ripes fall early. John Fiske's name was coupled, as we have seen, with those of Newton and Humboldt. Newton died at 86, Humboldt at 90. These men developed slowly. The hothouse methods were not for them. Fiske at 20 knew more than any of them did at 40. Fiske at 25 was a better man mentally and physically than he was at 35. At 40 he was refused life insurance because his measurement east and west was out of proportion to his measurement north and south. He used often to sit at his desk for 15 hours a day, writing and studying. The sedentary habit grew upon him. The vital organs got clogged with adipose tissue. The doctor told him that his diaphragm was too close to his lungs. A cheerful proposition, well worthy of a small, mouse-coloured medicus who dared not run the risk of displeasing a big patient by telling him the truth, that is, that deep breathing and active exercise in the open air can never be replaced through the use of something poured out of a bottle. People who eat too much, drink too much, smoke too much, and do not exercise enough have to pay for their privileges, even though they are able to work differential calculus with one hand and recite Xenophon's Anabasis backward. They all have the liver and lungs too close to the diaphragm, because that damnable invention of Sir Isaac Newton's, slumbers not nor sleeps, and all the vital organs droop and drop when we neglect deep breathing. Inertia is a vice. The gods cultivate levitation, which is a different thing from levity, meaning skyey gravitation, uplift, aspiration expressed in bodily attitude. When levitation lets go, gravity doubles its grip. The yogi of the East know vastly more about this theme than we do, and have made of deep breathing an art. Carry the crown on your head high, hold your chin in, and fill the top of your lungs by cultivating levitation. We are gods in the biscuit. After 4 years at Harvard, and the regulation 2 years at the Harvard Law School, John Fiske opened an office in Boston and gave his shingle to the breeze. No clients came, and this was well for the clients, also for John. The law is a business proposition. Its essence is the adjustment of differences between men, the lubrication of exchange, getting things on. Learned men very seldom make good lawyers. Law is a very practical matter, and as for law Latin, it can be learned in a week, and then should be mostly forgotten. The lawyer who asks his client about the causa sine qua non, or harangues the jury concerning the ipse dixit of de facto and de jure, will probably be mulcted for costs on general principles. "I always rule hard against the lawyer who quotes Latin," said a Brooklyn judge to me the other day. Happily, law Latin is now not used to any extent, except in Missouri. No more clients came to John Fiske than did to Wendell Phillips, who once had a law office on the same street. So John sent letters to the newspapers, wrote book reviews, and contributed essays to the Atlantic Monthly. Occasionally he would lecture for scientific clubs or societies. While still in the law school he had discounted the future, and married a charming young woman, who believed in him to an extent that would have made the average man pause. Marriages do not always keep pace exactly with the price of corn. Receipts in the Fiske law practice were not active. John Fiske was 26, his grandmother was dead, and family cares were coming along apace, all according to the law of Malthus. He accepted an offer to give substitute lectures at Harvard on history for a professor who had gone abroad for his health. This he continued, speaking for any absentee on any subject, and tutoring rich laggards for a consideration. Good boys low on phosphorus used to get him to start their daily themes, and those overtaken in the throes of trigonometry he often rescued from disgrace. Darwinism was in the saddle. Asa Gray was mildly defending it. Agassiz stood aloof, clinging to his early Swiss parsonage teachings, and the theological department marched on solid phalanx and scoffed and scorned. Yale, always having more theology than Harvard, threw out challenges. Fiske had saturated himself with the ideas of Darwin and Wallace, and his intellect was great enough to perceive the vast and magnificent scope of the origin of species. He prepared and read a lecture on the subject, all couched in gentle and judicial phrase, but with a finale that gave forth no uncertain sound. The overseers decided to ask Fiske to amplify the subject and give a course of lectures on the law of evolution. The subject grew under his hands, and the course extended itself into 35 lectures, covering the whole field of natural history, with many short excursions into the realms of biology, embryology, botany, geology, and cosmogony. Fiske was made assistant librarian at a salary of $1,000 a year. It was not much money, but it gave him a fixed position, with time to help the erring freshman and the mentally recalcitrant sophomore handicapped by rich parents. For 7 years Fiske held this position of assistant librarian, and hardly a student at Harvard during those years but acknowledged the personal help he received at the hands of John Fiske. Knowledge consists in having an assistant librarian who knows where to find the thing. Fiske's 35 lectures had evolved into that excellent book, Outlines of Cosmic Philosophy. The public were buying it. Evolution was fast taking its place as a fixed fact, and John Fiske was moving into public favor on the flood tide. There were demands for his lectures from various schools, colleges, and lyceums throughout the United States. He resigned his position so as to give all his time to writing and speaking, and Harvard, proud of her gifted son, elected him an overseer of the university, which position he held until his death. John Fiske died in 1901, suddenly, aged 59. Next to the originator of the great thought is the man who quotes it, says Ralph Waldo Emerson. Next to the discoverer of a great scientific truth is the man who recognizes and upholds it. The service done science by Fiske is beyond calculation. Fiske was not a Columbus upon the sea of science. He followed the course laid out by others, and was really never out of sight of a boy. He comes as near being a great scientist, perhaps, as any man that America has ever produced. America has had but 4 men of unmistakable originality. These are Franklin, Emerson, Whitman, and Edison. Each worked in a field particularly his own, and the genius of each was recognized in Europe before we were willing to acknowledge it here. But the word scientist can hardly be properly applied to any of these men. For want of a better name, we call John Fiske our greatest scientist. He was the most learned man of his day. In the realm of physical geography no American could approach him. The combined knowledge of everybody else was his. He had a passion for facts, a memory like a day book, and his systematic mind was disciplined until it was a regular Dewey card index. Louis Agassiz was born in Europe, but he was ours by adoption, and he might dispute with Fiske the title to first place in the American pantheon of science, were it not for the fact that the law of evolution was beyond his ken, being obscured by a marked, myopic, theological, stigmatic squint. Agassiz died in his sins, unconvinced, unrepentant, refusing the rite of extreme unction that Asa Gray offered him, his sensitive spirit writhing at mention of the word Darwin. On his tomb, Clio with moving finger has carved one of his own sentences: "Not all your tears shall blot a line of it." And there are the words of Agassiz: "Darwinism seeks to dethrone God, and replace him by a blind force called the law of evolution." So passed away the great soul of Louis Agassiz. Fiske has been called the Huxley of America. But Fiske was like Agassiz in this: he never had the felicity to achieve the ill will of the many. Fiske has also been called the Drummond of America. But Fiske was really a Henry Drummond and a Louis Agassiz rolled into one, the mass well seasoned with essence of Huxley. John Fiske made the science of Darwin and Wallace palatable to orthodox theology, and it is to the earnest and eloquent words of Fiske that we owe it that evolution is taught everywhere in the public schools, and even in the sectarian colleges of America today. The most universal opposition to Darwin's book arose from the idea that its acceptance would destroy the Christian religion. This was the plaintive idea put forth when Newton advanced his discovery of the law of gravitation, and also when Copernicus proclaimed the movement of the earth. These things were contrary to the Bible. Copernicus was a loyal Catholic. Sir Isaac Newton was a staunch churchman, but both kept their religion in watertight compartments, so that it never got mixed with their science. Gladstone never allowed his religion to tint his statesmanship, and we all know business men who follow the double entry scheme. That famous toast, "Here's to our wives and sweethearts, may they never meet," would suit most lawyers just as well if expressed this way: "Here's to our religion and our business, God knows they never meet." To Sir Isaac Newton, religion was something to be believed, not understood. He left religion to the specialists, recognizing its value as a sort of police protection for the state, and as his share in the matter he paid tithes and attended prayers as a matter of patriotic duty and habit. Voltaire recognized the greatness of Newton's intellect, but he could not restrain his aqua fortis, and so he said this: "All the scientists were jealous of Newton when he discovered the law of gravitation, but they got even with him when he wrote his book on the Hebrew prophecies." Newton wrote that book in his watertight compartment. But Newton was no hypocrite. The attitude of the Primrose Sphinx who bowed his head in the Church of England chapel, the Jew who rose to the highest office Christian England had to offer, and repeated Ben Ezra's prayer, was not the attitude of Newton. Darwin waived religion, and if he ever heard of the Bible, no one knew it from his writings. Huxley danced on it Tyndall and Spencer regarded the Bible as a valuable and more or less interesting collection of myths, fables, and folklore tales. Wallace sees it in a strain of prophetic truth, and regards it as gold-bearing quartz of a low grade. Fiske regarded it as the word of God, Holy Writ, expressed often vaguely, mystically, and in the language of poetry and symbol, but true when rightly understood. And so John Fiske throughout his life spoke in orthodox pulpits, to the great delight of Christian people, and at the same time wrote books on science and dedicated them to Thomas Huxley, Bishop of all agnostics. To the scientist the word supernatural is a contradiction. Everything that is in the universe is natural. The supernatural is the natural not yet understood, and that which is called the supernatural is often the fragment of a disordered, undisciplined, or undeveloped imagination. Some people think of imagination as that quality of mind which revels in tales of fairies and hobgoblins, but imagination of this character is undisciplined and undeveloped. The scientist who deals with the sternest of facts must be highly imaginative, or his work is vain. The engineer sees his structure complete ere he draws his plans. So the scientist divines the thing first, and then looks for it until he finds it. Were this not so, he would not be able to recognize things hitherto unknown when he saw them, nor could he fit facts to fact, like bones in a skeleton, and build a complete structure, if it all did not first exist as a thought. To reprove and punish children for flights of imagination, John Fiske argued, was one of the things done only by a barbaric people. Children first play at the thing which later they are to do well. Play is preparation. The man of imagination is the man of sympathy, and only such are those who benefit and bless mankind and help us on our way. John Fiske had imagination enough to follow closely and hold fellowship with the greatest mind the world has ever known. John Fiske believed that we live in a natural universe, and that God works through nature, and that, in fact, nature is the spirit of God at work. Doubts never disturbed John Fiske. Things that were not true technically and literally were true to him if taken in a spiritual or poetic way. God to him was a personal being, creating through the law of evolution because he chose to. The 6 days of creation were 6 eons or geological periods. No man has ever been more in sympathy with the discoverers in natural history than John Fiske. No man ever knew so much about his work as John Fiske. His knowledge was colossal, his memory prodigious. All in all, of the realm of science and philosophy, from microscopy and the germ theory to advanced astronomy and the birth of worlds, his glowing imagination saw the work of a beneficent Creator who saw above and beyond and outside of natural law, and with infinite wisdom and power did his own divine will. Little theologians who feared science on account of danger to pet texts received from him kindly pats on the head, as he showed them how both science and Scripture were true. He didn't do away with texts, he merely changed their interpretation. And often he discovered that the text which seemed to contradict science was really prophetic of it. John Fiske did not take anything away from anybody, unless he gave them something better in return. A man's belief is a part of the man, he said. Take it away by force, and he will bleed to death. But if the time comes when he no longer needs it, he will either slough it or convert it into something more useful. Every good thing begins as something else. Evolution is at work on the creeds as well as in matter. A monkey man will have a monkey belief. He evolves the thing he needs, and the belief that fits one man will not fit another. Religious opinions are never thrown away, they evolve into something else, and we use the old symbols and imagery to express new thoughts. John Fiske, unlike John Morley, considered compromise a great thing. Truth is a point of view. Let us get together, he used to say. And so he worked to keep the old as the foundation for the new. I once heard him interrupted in a lecture by a questioner who asked, "Why would you keep the church intact?" The question stung him into impassioned speech, which was better than anything in the manuscript. I cannot attempt to reproduce his exact language, but the intent was that as the church was the chief instrument in preserving for us the learning of Greece and Rome, so has she been the mother of art, the inspirer of music, and the protector of the outcast. Colleges, hospitals, libraries, art galleries, and asylums all come to us through the medium of religion. The convent was first a place of protection for oppressed womanhood. To disregard religion would be like repudiating our parents because we did not like their manners and clothes. The religious impulse is the art impulse, and both are manifestations of love, and love is the basis of our sense of sublimity. We surely will abandon certain phrases of religion. We will purify, refine, and beautify our religion, just as we have our table etiquette and our housekeeping. The millennium will come only through the scientific acceptance of piety. When church and state separated it was well, but when science and religion joined hands it was better. Science stands for the head, religion for the heart. All things are dual, and through the marriage of these two principles, one the masculine and the other the feminine, will come a renaissance of advancement such as this tired old world on her zigzag journeys has never seen. Sociology is the religious application of economics. Demonology has been replaced by psychology, and the betterment of man's condition on earth is now fast becoming the chief solicitude of the Church. It will thus be seen that John Fiske's hope for the future was bright and strong. The man was an optimist by nature, and his patience and good nature were always in evidence. He made friends and he held them. Huxley, who of all men hated piety that was flavoured with hypocrisy, loved John Fiske, and once wrote this: "There was a man sent from God by the name of John Fiske. Now John holds in his great and generous heart the best of all the Church has to offer. Hence I no longer go to prayers, but instead I invite John Fiske to come and dine with us every Sunday. And so we are made better. Amen." End of section 23. End of Little Journeys to the Homes of Great Scientists, by Elbert Hubbard.